السلام عليكم. الحقيقة يعني أنا اللي شجعني إن أنا أسجل محاضرة تاني بصوتي على ال recognition of COVID-19 as an occupational disease أو could it be considered an occupational disease. الديبيت والارجمنت اللي حصل أثناء الساينتفك داي الحقيقة أثار فضولي، وحسيت إن كنتوا فعلا مهتمين بالموضوع. فده طبعا شيماء الحقيقه عرضته في منتهى الروعه، والله ما هي مجامله. البنت يعني الحقيقه يعني قامت بالواجب كما ينبغي، وعرضت في البدايه ال definitions of occupational و work related diseases كما ينبغي كمقدمه انها تعرفنا بعد كده can we consider الكورونا فيروس او الكوفيد 19 disease as an occupational ولا لا. الديبيت كتير وكبير ومحتاج يعني تبحر اكتر في المعرفه والمعلومات. فانا برضو بقدر الامكان هعرض اللي عندي، ومطروح الموضوع للدiscussion فيما بعد في اي وقت فاضي بعد ما نخلص الامتحانات وكده، لان الموضوع الحقيقه في منتهى الاهميه. يعني احنا بنقول النهارده recognition of COVID-19 as an occupational disease او could it be considered an occupational disease. الحقيقه where 2020 was the most dangerous year on record for many health sectors, especially the workers in care. As April 2021, an estimated around 3 million people and still counting have died from COVID-19. So it's very important to discuss and explain. The initial medical reports and media coverage really have increased awareness of the risk imposed on healthcare workers, and particularly during that epidemic or that pandemic. It's a pandemic. It's moreover than epidemic. So, however, the health complications of COVID-19 for the global workforce are multifaceted and complex, representing careful reflection and we can say consideration to mitigate the probable or likely effect of that very bad disease. First of all, as we have discussed before during this session with Dr. Shayma, the difference between occupational disease and work-related or occupation-related disease. Very fast, occupational disease is the disease which arises out of or in the course of employment, and we have to take care of each word here in the definition, is the disease which arises out of. So it means a way of the work, or during work, or in the course of employment. And here is very important, and is due to a factor which is very peculiar to that occupation, which means that factor couldn't be found outside the work session, okay, or outside the workplace. So it's only one definite, well-known risk factor. Again, it's only one definite, well-known risk factor. Factor 1 causes disease 1. Factor 2 causes disease 2, and so on. Second, the attributable fraction, which is the cause effect, is very high and specific, which is here to be more than 50% of the causation of the disease. Third point, never been found among public. So one of the most important characters of occupational disease is it's never been found among public or never been exposed to the hazard in question. So it's very rare. So the occupational disease must be only caused by only one definite well-known risk factor with very high attributable fraction, cause effect, which is more than 50%. Third, and most important, it's never been found among any person outside the workplace. So it's uncommon to find silicosis. It's not uncommon, it's very rare. It's very rare to find silicosis outside workplaces where silica exposure is common. Asbestosis is the same. Many occupational diseases never been found among workers working in certain workplace or work sites. So it must be very clear here. فبالتالي occupational disease cover all pathological conditions. It's not very important here. It might be caused by physical, chemical, or whatever. It was discussed by our Dr. Seyman. Occupational disease, as we have said before, affects workers only, and only here is underscore. It affects only with clear relationship to the occupational exposure. Some person exposed to certain factor will develop certain disease. That certain disease will never been found outside the workplace. So, no incidence in general population, or very rare, very, very rare, and it will be explained later in our sessions, which is known as para-occupational disease. It's not our concern here. Okay, so now I believe that we have a common picture about the occupational disease and its characters. So, two main elements should exist in the definition of an occupational disease. I'm repeating here the definitions after even Dr. Samet to fix it in our mind to imagine what should be occupational disease complying with. I mean here complying with certain features, certain characters. So two main elements should exist in the definition of an occupational disease, and take care. Here, first one, the causal or the cause-effect relationship, which must be higher than 50%, and the fact that the disease occurs among a group of exposed persons with a frequency above the average morbidity of the rest of the population. It's very important, which means here we have a certain sector of population working in certain workplaces, exposed to certain workplace factor, have higher morbidity and higher mortality due to that exposure, which is not existing outside the workplace or work site. Okay. Work-related diseases, the attributable fraction here is very low. It's not specific. There in occupational disease, it was very specific. Here, it's non-specific. So we can find multiple risk factors. And that person might be exposed to certain exposure, which might be found in other places, but the exposure accelerates, exaggerates, or more complicate that disease by work factor. Again, a person, for example, has hypertension or has diabetes, and he is working in some workplace, and he might be exposed to extra factors that accelerates or exaggerates or complicate his diabetes or peptic ulcer or hypertension or back pain or neck pain due to that exposure. Some person has hypertension and exposed to certain chemical. That chemical is well known that or that it increases the severity of hypertension and so on. That's why we say it's multiple risk factors. Okay, so the diseases can be found among public who have other risk factors. For example, some person who is overweight, experiencing or exercising lazy life, just spending all the day in front of the TV, eating too much, he has many risk factors for hypertension, for diabetes, for atherosclerosis, for many factors. And he will be exposed to more risk factors in his disease, in his workplace, that may increase the probability of getting a disease, which will be not only one factor, it will be multiple factors. That's why we say the work-related disease or occupational-related disease is or are more common than occupational disease. We gave many examples of work-related disease. Here it's not important because I believe that Dr. Saima explained it very clearly. So, ultimately, for diagnosis of occupational health problem, now I'm not discussing the problem is COVID-19 occupational disease or work-related disease. Definitely, it's an occupational health problem. I'm not denying that factor or that truth. COVID-19 is an occupational health problem. But the debate here, is it occupational disease or work-related disease or it's nothing? So, for diagnosis of occupational health problem, first of all, we have to have sufficient evidence coming from history of exposure, from monitoring medical and environmental, from the records. Okay. Sorry, I will stop to drink هشرب بس وارجع لكم تاني. فبالتالي احنا بنقول ان ال diagnosis of occupational health problem requires sufficient evidence we should have a clear picture about the history of exposure. We have to be sure that he is exposed to the factors. We have to monitor medical and environmental factors that may be behind that disease, and we have to check the records. Second, we have to check or to be sure about the clinical picture that must fit in with what is known about the health effects following exposure to that specific agent. We have an idea about certain disease that it causes so and so and so and so. And my worker here developed some diseases that might complain with that or with those symptoms. So the clinical picture must be clear. And we have to refer to the time interval between exposure to occupational hazard and the development of the disease. This is the first point in clinical picture. Second, the intensity and duration of exposure. The shortest, for example, the shortest exposure period for which disease can occur and periods of exposure less than this are unlikely to cause the disease. Third point in the clinical picture, the maximum latent period. And we have a lot of definitions in the clinical picture to be sure is it occupationally caused or not. The time interval, intensity and duration of exposure, maximum latent period, and so on. And third point, differential diagnosis, because all of us know that many diseases are sharing sometimes most of symptoms and sometimes even signs. So we have to make sure about the differential diagnosis. So in diagnosis, we have to have sufficient evidence, clinical picture, and differential diagnosis to exclude other factors. Now, to be sure about the diagnosis of occupational health problem, we have certain suggestions or certain expectations that push us to diagnose or to even to pretend that we might have occupational health problem. First of them, when we find medical problem that doesn't fit the typical demographic profile. All of us know what is the typical or the demographic profile of any disease. If that disease is complying or convenient with the typical demographic profile about that disease that we know, if yes or no, we can or we may expect the probability of occupational health problem. Second, when an existing disease has acquired new characters or new pattern, suppose, for example, a patient with bronchial asthma. All of us know that bronchial asthma has no periodicity, and the expectation of bronchial asthma attack is existing anytime. The patient is already sitting very well, very nice in front of TV, and so suddenly feel an attack of bronchial asthma. this is not a character of occupational bronchial asthma. The periodicity and expectation of attacks in occupational bronchial asthma is well defined, because in occupational bronchial asthma, the attacks are expected just after exposure, and it's usually during Sunday morning after coming back from vacation. Third point, when the disease resists treatment, definitely it may withdraw our attention to that, or to the probability of occupational nature of that disease. When the problem occurs after exposure to well-known occupational origin and fits all the character or the main criteria of such exposure, definitely it will be an occupational health problem. Okay, now the diagnosis of occupational health problem, as a general rule, we say the symptoms are not sufficiently characteristic to enable an occupational disease to be diagnosed as such, which means we will never diagnose occupational health problems based on symptoms without the knowledge of the pathological changes produced by the physical, chemical, biological, or other factors encountered during the practice of occupation or work environment. So, which means that we have to have clear idea about the workplace criteria and the exposure criteria, and can we be sure 100% that that disease acquired during working in definite workplace or not. So the diagnosis will not be complete except complete monitoring, risk assessment, risk characterization, and so on. So speaking about certain diseases which are common among common public and are presenting or performing a pandemic health problem, we can never pretend that it might be or might not be occupational health problem. It's a very complicated decision. Last point before going before going deep into our problem is the criteria of occupational health problem, the general criteria for recognition, identification, and incorporation of any disease in the ILO list of occupational disease. It was issued during the meeting. I believe that Dr. Shaima also explained it very well, so we can bypass it. And here we have spoken before about the causal relationship, cause-effect relationship. Now, it's a very important point, and it's very decisive point to diagnose occupational health problem. In the causal relationship, we have the Bradford-Hill criteria. Bradford-Hill, he was an English senator, and he was a scientist, maybe in 1960 something, I don't remember. Anyhow, he had put certain criteria with all of the occupational health physicians all over the world are depending on a diagnosis of occupational health problems. And I believe also it was discussed by Dr. Shaima. How strong is the association between the exposure and the disease? Okay. Second, the consistency. Consistency, it means here different research reports have generally similar results or not, and similar conclusions or not towards that exposure. Third, specificity. The exposure to a specific risk factor results in clearly defined pattern of disease or diseases. Is it existing here in our problem? I mean COVID-19. And the other factors I will not go deep because all of them were discussed in a clear way by Dr. شيماء. الحقيقة كانت قالتهم كويس. Okay. Second, they occur in connection with work environment and or in specific occupation. So, to diagnose occupational health problems, first we have to depend on Bradford Health criteria, the 9 factors, okay, let them aside. Second, to diagnose the occupational health problem, they have to occur in connection with work environment and or, it means here both conditions, in specific occupations. Can it be applied in our problem in COVID-19 or not? We will discuss it later. Third, third point, first, we have to depend on Bradford Health criteria. Second, work and it must occur in worker in connection with certain workplace exposure. Third, they occur among the groups of persons concerned with a frequency which exceeds the average incidence within the rest of the population. Here is that statement. Can it be applied in COVID-19? Can we say that COVID-19 is more common among healthcare workers more than the general population? Definitely no. Okay. Fourth point, there is scientific evidence of a clearly defined pattern of disease following exposure and plausibility of cause. Can it be applied in COVID-19? Definitely no. So the question now, can COVID-19 be considered an occupational or work-related disease? And how probable COVID-19 is an occupational risk? Is it an Is it an occupational risk? Yes, it is an occupational risk. And how severe it will be with occupational exposure? Yes, it's severe. I confess. I'm giving you my confession. Yes, it's an occupational risk with a high risk factor, with a high level of exposure among the medical staff. Okay, I agree with you. Worker risk of occupational exposure, I will not go through because it was very well discussed and explained by Dr. Finally, the answer of the question, could COVID-19 be considered as an occupational disease? Definitely, it's not an occupational disease, but it may be an occupational health problem. So, the recognition of COVID-19 disease as being occupational is a specific example of clinical decision-making or applied clinical epidemiology. Again, it's a matter of clinical decision-making that may differ from country to country, and even it may differ from state to state, for example, like in the United States of America. So it's a clinical decision-making or applied clinical epidemiology. Why we say that? Because it's so suddenly, it's unprecedented, and even more, it's unfolded public health problem. Unfolded means here it's continuous. It's so far continuing to be a pandemic. So it's unfolded health problem, unfolded health emergency. COVID-19 actually created unique circumstances where many jobs that are not typically considered hazards before have suddenly found themselves face and face with a disaster. They became so suddenly very dangerous for the workers. With too much debate over recent months around the world whether COVID-19 is an occupational or no. So the recognition of COVID-19 as an occupational disease is particularly important, especially for care workers. Care workers here, I mean healthcare workers, delivery workers, many other sectors in the work market found themselves so suddenly in face-to-face with a disaster that threatened their life, threaten their wages, threaten even their work. We can say also that there is some sort of intersection of that pandemic with the workforce, which is a very complex topic that continues to impose a major burden and toll on workers and workplaces and work sites, in spite even that vaccination efforts are continuous and are accelerating. But even more, this intersection includes issues of vulnerability and susceptibility of workers. Also, how high the dynamic understanding, I mean here, our understanding of transmission and related occupational hygiene, also the multifaceted issues of testing for infection and related return to work, many factors that intersect that exist in between the pandemic and workers' health. And that's why we say that it's a very complex topic. I mean here the intersection of the pandemic with the workforce. So now the question whether COVID-19 is an occupational disease is specifically important in settings where there are high occurrences of workers being infected with the virus, like in work health, in healthcare workers, in delivery workers, as I said before, many workers in the work market. Please take care here. The evidence to diagnose occupational health problem, there must be an evidence. So that evidence must establish COVID-19 to be traceable to a definite employment-related cause and was not caused by any other likely source. Again, to be sure of our diagnosis, and we or to say in 100% that the COVID-19 disease is an occupational in this worker, we have to have evidence. That evidence must establish the COVID-19 to be traceable to definite factor or to definite agent or to definite workplace or to definite exposure in that worker, in this workplace, and that factor is employment related. And we have to be sure 100% that this disease wasn't acquired by any likely source, like for example in cinema, theaters, in clubs, in bus, in metro, or even in Gona, like I said before in our session, in our scientific day. So, to give a stamp that this COVID-19 is occupational in that patient, for example, Ahmad or Muhammad or whatever his name, we can say, and we have to be sure, that the virus only acquired due to certain workplace cause. And we can trace that virus to that workplace, and that Ahmed never acquired that virus in any other place. This is not existing in COVID-19 case. Also, in order to assess whether COVID-19 is an occupational disease, it's an essential to have distinct and transparent criteria for definition of occupational disease, which will help to distinguish these from diseases of different origins. And I have, I think we have discussed it before in a very detailed way. So we can say freely that around the world, the various recognition procedures even exist that would determine the occupational nature of the disease. Around the world, various recognition procedures exist. The definition or the recognition procedures differ in USA, from that in France, from that in England, from that in Sweden, from that in Finland. That's why the decision consequently differ from country to country based on many factors. For example, in Finland, they consider COVID-19 an occupational disease. In Ireland, it's not yet recognized as an occupational disease, but it's undergoing a review process. They are reviewing the problem now. Can they consider it occupational or not? It's ongoing process. In the United Kingdom, despite an attempt to add they are trying to add COVID-19 to the occupational list, but they have many problems so far. Again, We can proceed to another slide. Finally, the answer. COVID-19 is of course not explicitly mentioned in the ILO list of occupational disease, although the ILO mentioned or listed HIV, hepatitis B, and hepatitis C as a virus infection acquired by occupational exposure, but the situation of COVID-19 is not yet well established. As I have said before, it's unprecedented health problems. So far, no decision. First and foremost, it is the final answer. COVID-19 is not an occupational disease. It doesn't meet the criteria. Practically speaking, there needs to be a direct link between the exposure to the coronavirus and workplace. As I told you before, can we answer that the virus that has been acquired by Ahmed or by Muhammad can be traced only to a worksite exposure? Definitely we cannot say yes 100%. Why? Millions of people worldwide contracted the disease. Most of them didn't catch it in the workplaces. For myself, nearly all of my relatives have acquired COVID-19. My mother, my sisters, my nephews, all of them. Alhamdulillah, أنا لسه ربنا يستر. An occupational disease by definition is particularly to the risk of the occupation. That's not the case with COVID-19. This is the first. So the first and foremost, COVID-19 is not an occupational disease because it doesn't meet the criteria of definition of occupational disease, the criteria of entitling in ILO list. Moreover, by making COVID-19 a named occupational disease, here is a big problem. The policy makers will be creating a de facto presumption that all COVID-19 health problems are work-related. Here's a disaster. Here's a disaster. What about long COVID-19? What about multi-organ effects of COVID-19? What about the effects of COVID-19 treatment or hospitalization? All of them need answers, right? So, by confessing that COVID-19 is an occupational disease, we will be facing a huge amount of questions. What about long COVID? Long COVID? Is that an occupational? What about multi-organ effects of COVID-19? What about those persons who have acquired renal failure, hepatic failure, respiratory failure, or whatever joint problems, skin problems? Are these health problems occupational? What about the effects of COVID-19 treatment or hospitalization? Suppose a person had been put in hospital for many months and away of his work. Is it work-related vacation? So it's very important. It will be a de facto presumption that all COVID-19 health problems must be occupational or must be work-related. Because if we speak about long COVID-19, we can say that about 1 in 10 people with COVID-19 continues to experience symptoms. Can I consider from 100 million how will be diagnosed by COVID-19 and how many of them will be diagnosed as long COVID-19? It will be a disaster to diagnose half of the Egyptian population to have occupational health problem. Okay. What about compensation? And here is the top of the mountain, and here is the top or the iceberg of considering COVID-19 as an occupational health problem. Whether COVID-19 will be considered a compensatable occupational disease is the subject of a current, of a big, of a huge, of a disastrous debate, and will depend on national legislation. It's not a fixed picture, it's not a fixed frame for all countries. In the meantime, it's vital to identify the jobs Yes, it's vital. It's vital, and it's very important to save lives, to identify the jobs that face higher exposure and higher infection risk. It's our moral duty, it's our ethical duty to investigate whether COVID-19 should be recognized as an occupational disease and provide evidence of compensation. And here's the big debate, and here's the big problem. I believe finally that in state preps to address COVID-19 infection depends on many factors. If I remember, I told you before during the scientific day that the definition differs from state to state, from country to country. It's a global health problem. It's a decision which differs from country to country, and it differs for each state according to the international perspectives, according to the domestic perspectives, according to the trend of disease development perspectives in that area, in that country, the effectiveness of the intervention treatment perspectives, even the political and social economic impact perspectives. All of those finally, and finally, and I hope this presentation doesn't close the door of negotiation and debate and argument. I'm welcoming any questions. I welcome any debate. I welcome any argument to reach the final idea about the decision of that question. Could COVID-19 be considered as an occupational disease or not? But as I told before, it's not a personal decision. We're just only discussing the justifications of the topic, and we are discussing only the situation among the different countries among the world. And finally, recognizing COVID-19 as an occupational disease raises many technical issues. The existence of a list, and this is the most important one, the existence of a list of occupational diseases and the possibility of entering SARS-CoV-19 into the list. Does it exist in the ILO list or not? Even many countries have its own lists that differ from the ILO list. ILO list is it's not considered a law that has to be applied to all countries. Some countries have its own occupational list of its own list of occupational diseases. Okay, but the problem here, does that occupational list include COVID-19 or not? Okay, it differs from country to country, as I told you before. Second, assessing the exposure as an occupational disease must be connected to a certain level of exposure. I believe that we went so deep in that point many times. Third point, establishing clinical symptoms as well as the measures to take when worker presents a positive test can also give rise to different approaches. Last point, the recognition of COVID-19 as an occupational disease entails financial compensation for the worker, which is the main point. That's why I have highlighted that point, because I consider it the keystone of considering occupational or not considering COVID-19 as an occupational disease or not. The keystone here is money-wise, because we speak about millions and millions and millions of dollars that have to be paid for those workers. يعني أتمنى إن أنا أكون وضحت الصورة إلى حد ما. يعني طبعا برضو ده يعني ليس يعني مش عارف أقول إيه، يعني ليس تقليلا من قدر الدكتورة شيماء، إنما طبعا أنا بعرض وجهة نظري بطريقة يمكن تكون مختلفة، فالموضوع مطروح للمناقشة. لو حابين ان احنا نحدد يوم انا تحت امركم، لان الموضوع زي ما قلت لكم الموضوع مهم. ارجو ان كنتم ما تكونوش زهقتوا من الموضوع، ارجو ان كنتم ما تكونوش زهقتوا مني وتقولوا ايه الراجل اللي جاي بقاله 5000 سنة بره ده وجاي يوجع دماغنا. انا برحب بالجميع وبرحب بكل الاراء، وبرضه برجع اقول تاني والله يعني انا لما عرضت البرزنتيشن دي ليس انتقاصا من امر الدكتوره شيماء خالص نهائي، بس انا حابب ان انا اعرضها بطريقتي، لانها او لان الموضوع يعني مهم جدا وفي نقاش كتير جدا. وكانت الدكتوره رانيا اتكلمت على الريسك اسسمنت، وانا حابب ان احنا لو نفتح جلسه نقاش عن الريسك اسسمنت والماني strains that have been found in COVID-19 disease, which is very important point. طبعا النقطه دي في منتهى الاهميه، يعني بتقول لي ازاي ان احنا نعزل certain strain من الكوفيد 19 من certain patient وما نقولش ان ده اوكيبيشنال. والله انا معاك يا دكتوره رانيا، انا معاكي جدا جدا ومتعاطف مع الناس، انما زي ما قلت لك الموضوع له القرار له scientific وله لوجيك وله ethical. شفت المصيبه؟ لا scientific ولا لوجيك ولا ethical، وانما الموضوع political economic. يعني في مشاكل كتيره. بالظبط انا بشبهه بالقاضي اللي بيحكم بالورق. الراجل بيبقى عارف معروف كويس جدا انه ذابح واحد، بس لا في شهود انه ذبح، ولا في شهود انه دفن، ولا في شهود انه عمل المصيبه الزرقاء دي، والورق اللي قدام القاضي بيقول لك ان الراجل ده بريء تمام التمام، فبيطلعوا براءه. يعني ارجو ان انا ما اكونش تقلت عليكم، واهلا بيكم في اي تعليق. شكرا.